The crystal champagne flute trembled imperceptibly in Moon Zoe Vaughn's grip, a microcosm of anxiety that she forced into stillness through sheer will. She positioned herself near the gilded archway of the onyx room, a phantom-impressed gray fabric, watching Seoul's apex predators circle each other with the elegant menace of sharks in deep water. Above her, Venetian chandeliers cast amber light across faces that appeared in Forbes lists and arrest warrants with equal frequency, their glow transforming expensive watches into molten gold warnings strapped to dangerous wrists. Zoe straightened the starched collar of her uniform. It was immaculate and regulation perfect, but surrounded by the whisper of bespoke Italian silk and the rustle of handcrafted wool that cost more than her yearly salary, it felt like a brand of invisibility. Every soul in the Cathedral of Shadows, as the staff secretly called it, communicated in a dialect she had never been taught, the micropause before signing a contract that would bankrupt competitors, the calculated angle of a wine glass held just so to signal allegiance or threat, the practiced indifference of those who owned the city's heartbeat. Zoe understood none of their codes. To the politicians and tycoons populating this temple of old money and fresh blood, she was an architectural necessity, a moving fixture required for ambience but unworthy of acknowledgement. She recognized some faces from the headlines that her younger brother obsessively clipped for his college sociology project, the real estate magnate whose smile contained all the warmth of a January pre-dawn, the pharmaceutical heiress whose beauty was weaponized and clinical. But Zoe's attention kept betraying her professional training, pulled like iron filings to a magnet, toward the alcove where the truly dangerous capital congregated. This was the domain of men whose tuxedos fit like Kevlar, who negotiated in murmurs that could collapse markets or end political careers before dessert was served. Zoe knew she should be checking ice buckets or replacing napkins. Yet her gaze remained tethered to the velvet throne near the floor-to-ceiling windows, where the neon constellation of Seoul's skyline glittered behind its occupant like an empire he had personally constructed from concrete and compromise. At the center of that dark gravity sat Tae-sung. Even a waitress from the forgotten districts knew that name, though it was only ever spoken in the relative safety of the staff break room. The business sections called him a logistics innovator or import-export magnate. Polite camouflage for the ink cloud, the shadow architect of Seoul's underground economy. He was younger than the whispered legends suggested, perhaps early 30s. His black hair was slicked with deliberate precision, every strand a calculation. His face was a study in angular sovereignty, high cheekbones and bronze skin sculpted with the austere beauty of someone who had weaponized every aspect of his presentation. When Tae-sung moved, even fractionally, adjusting the cuff of his Tom Ford jacket to reveal the coiled edge of ink beneath, the entire room recalibrated. It was a silent choreography, bodies shifting backward instinctively, creating breathing room for the apex predator. Men like him didn't occupy the same dimension as women like Zoe. She existed to survive her shift, collect tips that would cover her brother's university fees, then vanish back to their cramped apartment where the plumbing groaned and the winter cold crept through cracked window panes. She wrenched her eyes downward, repeating her internal liturgy, stay invisible. Stay employed. Stay breathing. Vaughn. Her manager's voice crackled through her earpiece, razor-edged with warning. He materialized beside her like a malevolent spirit, his eyes scanning for imperfection. Table 4. Now. And stop looking at the corner. Do you want to remain a ghost or become a headline? Zoe's fingers tightened around the champagne bottle, the glass cold as accusation against her palm. She didn't want to be noticed. She had perfected the art of non-existence. But as she pivoted toward Director Kang's table, Table 4, the provocation station, she felt it, a pressure between her shoulder blades, a gaze so concentrated and heavy it felt like the weight of inevitability itself pressing against her spine. She glanced back, just once, for a fraction of a heartbeat. The man in the velvet throne wasn't examining his associates or surveying his kingdom beyond the glass. Tae-sung was staring directly at her, his obsidian eyes narrowed with the focused intensity of someone who had just identified the single real element in a room meticulously constructed from lies. And in that frozen moment, Moon Zoe Vaughn understood with crystalline certainty that her invisibility had just shattered like the champagne flute she carried, irreparable, irreversible, and infinitely more dangerous than she could have ever imagined. Hello family. Before we continue, I would like to know where you are watching from. Tell me what you think in the comments. Subscribe, because the next chapter changes everything. Now, back to the story. The Onyx and Ivy Club didn't advertise. It didn't need to. If you required an explanation of where it was or how to gain entry, you were precisely the type of person who would never cross its threshold. The building itself was unremarkable from the street, a narrow facade of black granite wedged between a luxury watch boutique and a private bank in Gangnam. No neon signs. No doorman in an elaborate uniform. Just a single brass plate so small you could cover it with your palm, engraved with 2 words, members only. But beyond that deceptive entrance, the club transformed into something else entirely. The main floor stretched impossibly wide, an architectural trick that made Zoe wonder if they had somehow purchased the neighboring buildings and hollowed them out like a secret. The ceiling soared 3 stories high, wrapped in dark wood panels that absorbed sound and created pockets of privacy even in a crowded room. Everything inside whispered money. Not the loud, flashy kind that screamed for attention, but the quiet, ancient kind that had been passed down through generations like a hereditary disease. The leather chairs were Italian. The marble floors were imported from quarries that only accepted orders from governments and billionaires. Even the air felt expensive, filtered and temperature-controlled to exactly 20 degrees Celsius year-round. The guests matched their environment perfectly. Women draped in jewelry that cost more than small cars. Men whose watches could pay off Zoe's brother's entire university debt with a single clasp. They moved through the space with the easy confidence of people who had never been told no, who had never waited in line, who had never felt the particular anxiety of checking a bank balance before buying groceries. Status wasn't just important here. It was oxygen. It determined where you sat, who approached your table, how quickly staff responded to your smallest gesture. The hierarchy was invisible but absolute, enforced through glances and pauses and the microscopic adjustments of body language that Zoe had learned to read like a survival manual. This was the Cathedral of Shadows. And tonight, its carefully balanced ecosystem was about to be shattered. Zoe had been invisible long before she put on the uniform. It was a skill she'd learned young, growing up in the cramped neighborhoods where being noticed meant being targeted. Her apartment was 40 minutes away by subway, in a building where the elevator only worked half the time and the hallway lights flickered like dying fireflies. She shared 3 rooms with her younger brother Marcus, who was brilliant in the way that made teachers shake their heads with a mixture of admiration and sadness. Brilliant enough for Seoul National University. Not wealthy enough to afford it without help. The acceptance letter still hung on their refrigerator, held by a magnet shaped like a cartoon bear. Beneath it, Zoe had taped the payment schedule. Tuition. Books. Housing. Lab fees. The numbers blurred together into an impossible mountain of debt that grew larger every semester. This job was her answer. The tips alone covered 2 months of expenses if she worked enough shifts. The base salary handled rent and utilities. And if she stayed quiet, stayed efficient, stayed completely and utterly invisible to the dangerous people who filled the Onyx and Ivy Club, she could keep this lifeline intact. The rules were simple. Never make eye contact unless serving directly. Never speak unless spoken to. Never react to the things you overheard, the affairs, the bribes, the casual discussions of ruining competitors or buying politicians like takeout food. Become furniture. Become air. Become nothing. Her manager had explained it during her first week, his breath smelling of cigarettes and desperation. These people don't want to see you. They want to believe their drinks refill themselves, that their tables clean themselves. You're a service ghost. The moment they notice you exist, you're done. Zoe nodded, understanding perfectly. She'd been practicing invisibility her entire life. But invisibility required vigilance. It meant memorizing which tables tipped well and which ones complained about imaginary problems. It meant knowing when to approach and when to wait. It meant never, ever catching the attention of someone powerful enough to either save you or destroy you. Tonight, she had broken that final rule. And Tae-sung had noticed. Tae-sung's arrival was announced not by fanfare, but by silence. The usual hum of conversation didn't stop exactly, but it changed texture, becoming softer and more cautious, as if the air itself had decided to behave. Zoe noticed it first in the way her manager suddenly straightened his tie, then in how the senior staff positioned themselves near the entrance like soldiers awaiting inspection. He came through the private elevator at precisely 9 o'clock, flanked by 2 men in identical black suits who moved with the controlled grace of trained fighters. But it was Tae-sung who commanded attention, who seemed to pull gravity itself toward him as he crossed the marble floor. He wore Tom Ford, charcoal gray so dark it was nearly black, tailored to emphasize the lean muscle beneath. His white shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, a calculated informality that somehow made him more intimidating rather than less. The tattoos everyone whispered about were barely visible, just the edge of ink curling past his left cuff, a serpent's tail or dragon's claw, impossible to tell which. His face was expressionless. Not calm, but empty, as if he'd trained himself to show nothing that could be used against him. Sharp cheekbones cast shadows across his features. His eyes, dark and unreadable, scanned the room with the efficiency of someone inventorying assets and threats simultaneously. The velvet chair near the corner windows had been waiting for him, positioned perfectly to observe both the entrance and the entire main floor. He sat without ceremony, without acknowledgement of the staff member who rushed to adjust the table settings. One of his associates handed him a glass of whiskey, never champagne for the ink cloud, and he accepted it with a minimal nod. Within seconds, an invisible boundary formed around his table. No one approached without invitation. Conversations nearby lowered to whispers. Even Director Kong, seated 3 tables away with his usual smirk, seemed suddenly aware of being watched by something larger and more dangerous than himself. Zoe felt it from across the room, that shift in atmosphere, like the moment before a thunderstorm when the air becomes charged and heavy. Tae-sung wasn't just a guest. He was a force of nature that had just entered the Cathedral of Shadows. And everyone, including her, understood that the evening's rules had fundamentally changed. Director Kong had been waiting for this moment all evening, and it showed in the predatory gleam of his smile. He rose from table 4 with theatrical slowness, adjusting his Rolex so it caught the chandelier light. His associates followed his lead, a pack of wolves trailing their alpha across the polished floor. The distance between Kang's table and Tae-sung's corner was perhaps 20 feet, but it felt like crossing a battlefield. Zoe was refilling water glasses nearby, close enough to hear but trained to appear deaf. Her hands moved automatically while her pulse hammered against her ribs. Tae-sung. Kang's voice carried just far enough to be heard by the surrounding tables. A public greeting meant to be witnessed. I see you've decided to grace us with your presence. I thought perhaps you'd gone soft, staying away from the cathedral for so long. Tae-sung didn't look up from his whiskey. The insult hung in the air like smoke. Kong continued, his tone dripping with false concern. There are rumors, you understand. People talk. They say the logistics empire is slipping through your fingers. That you've lost your edge, become too comfortable. Too civilized. He emphasized the last word like it was a disease. One of Kang's associates laughed, a sharp bark quickly silenced by a glance from Tae-sung that could have frozen fire. The shipping contracts in Busan, Kong pressed, emboldened by his own audience. The warehouse situation in Incheon. Some might say these are signs of weakness. That perhaps the ink cloud has forgotten how to fight, how to remind people why they should fear him. The room had gone completely silent now. Even the background music seemed to fade. This wasn't just conversation, it was a challenge, delivered in the sophisticated language of Seoul's elite but understood by everyone present as a declaration of intent. Tae-sung finally lifted his eyes. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The look he gave Kong contained entire volumes of violence, promises written in blood and consequence. But Kong had already planted his seed of doubt. The question now hung over the entire cathedral, was the apex predator still dangerous, or had he become just another businessman in an expensive suit? Zoe's earpiece crackled to life with a sound that felt like a gunshot in the tense silence. Vaughn. Table 4. Immediately. Her manager's voice was tight with anxiety, the kind that came from knowing he was sending a lamb into a wolf's den but having no other choice. She felt her stomach drop. Table 4. Director Kang's table. The epicenter of the challenge that had just been thrown at Tae-sung like a grenade with the pin already pulled. Her hands trembled as she lifted the champagne bottle from the service station. She forced them still through sheer willpower, remembering Marcus's tuition bill, remembering the flickering lights in their hallway, remembering every reason she needed to keep this job. Be invisible, her manager hissed as she passed him. His fingers gripped her elbow hard enough to bruise. Don't look at anyone. Don't react to anything you hear. Get in, refill, get out. These men are not playing games tonight. Zoe nodded, her throat too tight for words. She understood what he wasn't saying, one wrong move, one misplaced glance, one accidental moment of being noticed, and she could become collateral damage in whatever war was brewing between Kong and Tae-sung. The walk to table 4 felt endless. Her footsteps were silent on the marble, years of practice making her movement fluid and unobtrusive. But she was acutely aware of every eye in the room, of the weight of attention focused on this corner of the cathedral. Kang had returned to his seat, his associates clustered around him like courtiers around a king. They were talking in low voices, heads bent together, occasionally glancing toward Tae-sung's corner with expressions that mixed triumph and calculation. As Zoe approached, Kang's conversation stopped. He leaned back in his chair, that predatory smile returning to his face. She could feel him watching her, the way a cat watches a mouse, not because he's hungry but because cruelty is its own entertainment. She reached for the first glass, her hand steady despite the terror screaming through her veins. She was a ghost. She was invisible. She was nothing. But she was about to become everything. Tae-sung had spent 15 years perfecting the art of not feeling. Every emotion was a vulnerability. Every attachment was a weapon someone could use against him. He'd learned to look at people and see only variables, assets, threats, or obstacles to be managed. The women who threw themselves at him in clubs like this were equations he never bothered to solve. But then he saw her. The waitress moving between tables with practiced invisibility, her dark skin a contrast against the starched gray uniform, her movements economical and careful. She was pouring champagne at Kang's table, and something about her caught his attention in a way he couldn't immediately explain. It wasn't her beauty, though she possessed that in quiet measure. It was something else. Something in the way she held herself, present but absent, there but not there, existing in a space between visibility and erasure that he recognized because he'd occupied that same space once, long ago, before he became the ink cloud. Kang said something and his associates laughed, the sound cruel and deliberate. The waitress didn't react. Her face remained professionally neutral, but Tae-sung saw the microscopic tension in her jaw, the slight tightening of her grip on the champagne bottle. She was listening. She was present. She was real in a room full of performances. He found himself studying her with the same intensity he normally reserved for business rivals. She finished at Kang's table and moved away, her posture perfect, her expression carefully blank. But as she passed near a pillar, he saw her shoulders drop fractionally, saw her take a breath that spoke of relief and exhaustion. She was surviving, not thriving. Working, not playing. She didn't belong to this world of excess and violence. She was trapped in it, the same way he had once been trapped before he learned to make the trap his weapon. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Tae-sung felt something stir beneath the careful emptiness he'd cultivated. Not an attraction exactly. Recognition. She was the only honest thing in this cathedral of shadows. And honesty, he realized with cold calculation, could be the most dangerous weapon of all. Kang was still smiling when Tae-sung stood. The movement was fluid, deliberate, carrying the weight of a decision already made. His associates froze mid-conversation. The entire room seemed to hold its breath as the ink cloud crossed the floor with predatory grace, his destination clear and impossible. He was walking toward the waitress. Zoe sensed him before she saw him, that same heavy pressure she'd felt earlier now multiplied, bearing down on her like physical force. She turned, champagne bottle still in hand, and found herself face to face with Tae-sung. Up close, he was terrifying. Not because of obvious threat, but because of the absolute control in every line of his body, the cold intelligence in his dark eyes that seemed to calculate her worth in fractions of seconds. "Sir, can I?" she started, falling back on training, on protocol, on the safety of invisibility. He didn't let her finish. His hand moved with surprising gentleness, fingers curling around her waist with the confidence of ownership. The champagne bottle slipped from her grasp, caught by one of his associates who had materialized beside them, as Tae-sung pulled her closer with inexorable force. The room went silent. Not the polite quiet of before, but complete, suffocating silence. Even the background music seemed to die. Zoe's mind screamed warnings, but her body was frozen, trapped in the gravitational pull of this man who had never, in 15 years of documented public appearances, shown interest in anyone. His other hand rose to her chin, tilting her face upward with fingers that were cold and steady. "Don't move," he murmured, so quietly only she could hear. Not a request. A command. Then Tae-sung did something that shattered every unspoken rule of the Cathedral of Shadows. He leaned down and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was brief, controlled, clinical in its execution. But its impact detonated through the room like a bomb. Gasps erupted from nearby tables. Someone dropped a glass. Director Kang's smile vanished, replaced by an expression of shock and dawning realization. The apex predator had just claimed a waitress. In public. In front of everyone. Tae-sung pulled back, his face still expressionless. But his hand remained on Zoe's waist, a statement, a brand, a declaration of war written in flesh and consequence. Time fractured into before and after. Before the kiss, Zoe had been nobody. A ghost in grey fabric, a pair of hands that poured champagne, a face that guests looked through rather than at. After the kiss, she was the only person in the room that mattered. Every eye was on her. Every conversation had stopped. Even the staff stood frozen in various poses of shock, trays held at awkward angles, mouths slightly open. The background music had died, someone in the control booth had apparently forgotten to breathe, let alone manage the sound system. Tae-sung's hand was still on her waist, warm and heavy and impossible to ignore. She could feel her heartbeat hammering against her ribs so hard she wondered if he could feel it too. Her lips still tingled from the pressure of his mouth, clinical and controlled but undeniable. "What?" she started, her voice barely a whisper. "Not here," he said quietly, his eyes scanning the room with the same cold calculation as before, as if he hadn't just destroyed her entire existence with a single gesture. "Stay close to me." The spell broke. Conversation erupted across the cathedral like a dam bursting. Whispers became urgent discussions. Phones emerged from pockets and purses, fingers flying across screens as the news spread beyond these walls at the speed of light. Zoe understood with sudden, terrible clarity what had just happened. Her invisibility, her only protection, her carefully maintained survival strategy, had been obliterated. She was no longer a service ghost. She was the girl the ink cloud had kissed. The waitress who had somehow caught the attention of Seoul's most dangerous man. She was visible now. Completely, irrevocably visible. And visibility, in this world of predators and prey, was the most dangerous thing you could be. Her manager appeared at her elbow, his face pale with panic and confusion. He opened his mouth to speak, but Tae-sung's glance silenced him instantly. Whatever authority her manager had once held over her had just evaporated, replaced by something far more powerful and infinitely more terrifying. Zoe looked toward table 4. Director Kong was staring at her with an expression that made her blood run cold. He was smiling again. But this time, it was the smile of a hunter who had just spotted his prey. Director Kong had been in the game long enough to recognize a gift when one appeared. He leaned back in his chair, fingers drumming against the armrest with barely contained excitement. Across the room, Tae-sung stood with the waitress still caught in his orbit, and Kong could already see the chessboard rearranging itself in his favor. For 15 years, the ink cloud had been untouchable. No family to threaten. No lovers to kidnap. No weaknesses to exploit. He moved through Seoul's underworld like a machine, making decisions based purely on profit and power, never allowing emotion to cloud his judgment. It was what made him dangerous. It was what made him unbeatable. Until tonight. "Did you see that?" one of Kang's associates whispered, leaning close. "He's never." "I saw it," Kong interrupted, his smile widening. "Everyone saw it. That's the point." His mind was already calculating angles, mapping possibilities. The girl was nobody, he could tell from her uniform, from the way she'd moved through the room before this moment. A service worker. Probably supporting a family. Definitely vulnerable. And now she was Tae-sung's declared interest. His possession, marked in front of Seoul's elite. The kiss wasn't romance, Kong understood that immediately. It was a power play, a response to the challenge he'd issued earlier. Tae-sung was proving he wasn't soft, that he could still make bold moves. But bold moves created vulnerabilities. Always. "Find out everything about her," Kong said quietly to the man on his right. "Name, address, family, debts, everything. I want it within the hour." The associate nodded and slipped away, phone already in hand. Kang's eyes tracked the waitress as Tae-sung guided her toward the private elevator, his hand still possessive on her waist. She looked terrified, which was smart. She should be terrified. She'd just become the most valuable piece on the board without even understanding the game. Tae-sung thought he was making a statement of strength. But he'd actually handed Kong the one thing he'd needed all along, leverage. The ink cloud had finally shown weakness. And weakness, in the Cathedral of Shadows, was the same thing as blood in the water. The private elevator descended in silence so complete that Zoe could hear her own panicked breathing. Tae-sung stood beside her, his hand no longer on her waist but his presence still overwhelming in the confined space. Two of his associates flanked them, faces blank, hands resting near their jacket pockets in a way that suggested weapons were close at hand. "Where are we going?" Zoe finally managed, her voice hoarse. "I need to, my shift isn't over. My manager will." "Your manager doesn't matter anymore," Tae-sung said, his tone factual rather than cruel. He was looking at his phone, scrolling through messages with the same clinical efficiency he'd shown when kissing her. "Neither does your shift." The elevator doors opened onto an underground parking garage that looked like it cost more than her entire apartment building. Luxury cars gleamed under fluorescent lights. A black Mercedes waited directly in front of them, engine already running. Panic spiked through Zoe's chest. "I don't understand what's happening. Why did you get in the car?" It wasn't a request. One of the associates opened the back door. Zoe didn't move, her feet rooted to the concrete floor. Every instinct she'd developed growing up in dangerous neighborhoods was screaming at her to run, to fight, to do anything except get into a car with a man who could make her disappear without consequence. Tae-sung finally looked up from his phone, his dark eyes meeting hers with unsettling directness. "You have two choices. Come with me and live. Or go home and be dead by morning. Director Kong is already sending people to find your address." The words hit her like ice water. "What? Why would he?" "Because I kissed you," Tae-sung said simply. "In front of everyone. Which means you're mine now. Which means you're leveraged against me. Which means you're a target." He paused, studying her face. "Do you understand?" Zoe's legs felt weak. She thought of Marcus, home studying for midterms, completely unaware that his sister had just become collateral damage in a war she didn't understand. "Get in the car," Tae-sung repeated, softer this time. "I'll explain everything. But we need to move now." Zoe got in the car. The Mercedes moved through Seoul's nighttime streets with predatory smoothness, tinted windows turning the city lights into abstract streaks of color. Zoe sat as far from Tae-sung as the backseat allowed, her hands clenched in her lap. Her mind raced through possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. Kidnapping. Trafficking. Murder. The stories she'd heard whispered in the staff break room about what happened to service workers who caught the wrong kind of attention. "You're thinking I'm going to hurt you," Tae-sung said, not looking at her. He was still focused on his phone, conducting business as if he hadn't just appended someone's entire existence. "I'm not." "Then what do you want?" The words came out sharper than she'd intended, fear transforming into anger. He finally put the phone away, turning to face her fully. In the dim light of the car's interior, his features seemed carved from stone, beautiful and cold and utterly inhuman. "Director Kong challenged me tonight," he said, his voice measured and calm, like a professor explaining a simple concept. "He questioned my control, my strength. In front of witnesses. That kind of challenge requires a response, or I look weak. Weakness invites more challenges. More challenges mean instability. Instability means people die." Zoe stared at him. "So you kissed me? How does that?" "The kiss was a declaration," Tae-sung interrupted. "In the language of power that people like Kong understand, I claimed you. Publicly. Which means you're under my protection. Anyone who touches you is declaring war on me directly." "Protection?" Zoe's voice rose. "You just painted a target on my back." "The target was already there," he said flatly. "The moment Kong saw you serving his table, heard you listening to his conversation, he would have used you eventually. This way, at least you're valuable alive. As my declared interest, you're untouchable. As a random waitress who might have overheard something, you'd already be in a river somewhere." The casual way he said it, the matter-of-fact acceptance of murder as business strategy, made Zoe's stomach turn. "I didn't ask for this," she whispered. "No one asks for this," Tae-sung replied. "But you're in it now. So we adapt." Zoe's phone buzzed in her pocket at exactly midnight. She pulled it out with shaking hands, seeing Marcus's name flash across the screen. Relief and terror hit simultaneously, relief that he was calling, terror about why he might need to. "Marcus?" She answered before the first ring finished. "Zoe." Her brother's voice was tight with barely controlled panic. "There are men outside our building. 3 of them. They've been asking the neighbors about you. where you work, what time you come home, if you have family. The world tilted. Zoe gripped the phone so hard her knuckles went white. Don't go outside. Lock the door. Don't open it for anyone. What's happening? Who are these people? Tae-sung was already moving, leaning forward to speak to the driver in rapid Korean. The car accelerated, changing direction with smooth precision. Marcus, listen to me carefully, Zoe said, forcing her voice steady even as panic clawed at her throat. Go to Mrs. Kim's apartment across the hall. Stay there. Don't come home until I call you back. You're scaring me. Please. Her voice broke. Just do it. Now. The line went quiet for a moment, then she heard movement, a door opening, Marcus's hurried footsteps. Okay. I'm going. But Zoe, what? The call, cut off. Zoe stared at her phone, her breathing shallow and rapid. All of this, the kiss, the car, the explanations about power and protection, had felt almost abstract until this moment. A dangerous game she'd been forced into but didn't fully understand. Now it was real. Now it was Marcus. How long until we get to her apartment? Tae-sung asked the driver. 15 minutes in this traffic. Make it 10. Tae-sung turned to Zoe, and for the first time since the kiss, his expression showed something other than cold calculation. Not sympathy exactly, but recognition. Understanding. Your brother? He asked quietly. Zoe nodded, not trusting her voice. Then we protect him too, Tae-sung said. It wasn't a question or an offer. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the same certainty he'd used for everything else tonight. The stakes had just moved from survival to something infinitely more precious. And Zoe realized with bitter clarity that she was now completely dependent on the very man who had put her family in danger. The Mercedes pulled to a stop 2 blocks from Zoe's apartment building, headlights off, engine idling in the shadows. Through the windshield, she could see 3 men loitering near the entrance, their postures too casual to be genuine. They were waiting. Hunting. My men are already moving your brother to a safe location, Tae-sung said, checking his phone. He'll be protected. Zoe's hands were still shaking. The reality of what was happening, that her little brother, brilliant Marcus with his sociology textbooks and his dreams of changing the world, was now a target because of her, felt like drowning in ice water. This is my fault, she whispered. If I had just kept my head down. You did keep your head down, Tae-sung interrupted. That's not why this happened. Then why? Zoe turned to face him, anger finally cutting through the fear. You said Kong would have used me anyway. But I'm nobody. I'm a waitress. What could I possibly? She stopped mid-sentence, a memory surfacing with sudden, terrible clarity. Earlier that evening. Before the kiss. Before everything exploded. She'd been refilling champagne at table 4, invisible as always, while Kong and his associates talked in low voices they assumed no one would hear or care about. The Busan shipment, she said slowly, the pieces clicking together. They were talking about rerouting containers through a different port. Something about avoiding inspections. And bank account numbers, I remember because one of them made me repeat it back, testing if I was paying attention. He laughed when I couldn't. Tae-sung had gone completely still, his dark eyes fixed on her with laser focus. What numbers? Zoe closed her eyes, pulling the memory back. She'd been trained to listen without listening, to hear without processing. But her mind had caught fragments anyway, storing them automatically the way it stored hundreds of drink orders and table numbers every shift. She recited the account numbers, the port names, the dates mentioned in that conversation. When she finished, Tae-sung was smiling. Not the cold, calculated expression from before. This was something sharper, more dangerous. You're not just a liability, he said quietly. You're a weapon. The safe house was in Gangnam, hidden behind the facade of a luxury office building. 23rd floor, corner unit with bulletproof windows and security that would make a bank jealous. Zoe stood in the middle of the immaculate living room, still wearing her waitress uniform, feeling completely out of place among the designer furniture and abstract art that probably cost more than her yearly salary. Tae-sung paced near the windows, phone pressed to his ear, speaking in rapid Korean. When he finally hung up, he turned to face her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Your brother is secure, he said. My people have him at a different location. He's asking questions, but he's safe. Relief made Zoe's knees weak. She sat down on the leather couch before she could fall down. The information you gave me about Kang's shipment, Tae-sung continued, moving to stand in front of her. It's accurate. I had it verified. Those account numbers trace back to a money laundering operation that's been hidden for 2 years. You just handed me the key to dismantling half of Kang's financial network. I just repeated what I heard, Zoe said quietly. No. Tae-sung crouched down so they were eye level, his intensity focused entirely on her. You did something much more valuable. You were invisible while doing it. People say things around service workers that they would never say around business rivals. They forget you're human. They forget you're listening. Understanding dawned slowly. You want me to spy? I want you to do what you've already been doing, he corrected. Be a ghost. Move through spaces where people don't notice you. Listen to conversations they think are private. You've been trained for this your entire career, you just didn't realize it was training. Zoe thought about the countless nights at the Cathedral of Shadows, the secrets she'd overheard without trying, the deals and affairs and betrayals discussed over champagne like she was a piece of furniture. And if I say no? She asked. Tae-sung's expression didn't change. Then you and your brother disappear into protective custody indefinitely. Hidden but useless. Or you help me finish what Kang started tonight, and when it's over, you both get your lives back. It wasn't really a choice at all. 3 days later, Zoe stood in front of a full-length mirror wearing a dress that cost more than 6 months of her rent. The gown was midnight blue silk, a designer label she'd only seen in magazines, tailored perfectly to her body by people who had measured her with the precision of architects. Her hair, usually pulled back in a practical bun, had been styled by a professional into elegant waves. Diamond earrings, borrowed, Tae-sung had assured her, though they looked real enough to buy a car, glinted at her ears. She looked like she belonged in the Cathedral of Shadows. Like one of them. The transformation made her skin crawl. You need to sell this, Tae-sung said from behind her. He was wearing another Tom Ford suit, this one charcoal with subtle pinstripes. Kang needs to believe you're my weakness. That I'm distracted by you. Emotional. And then what? Zoe turned to face him. Then he makes his move. And we're ready for it. The party was being held in a private gallery in Itaewon, art on the walls worth millions, guests who controlled billions. Zoe arrived on Tae-sung's arm, his hand warm against the small of her back, and the reaction was immediate. Conversation stopped. Heads turned. The waitress from the cathedral, the girl who'd been kissed in front of everyone, was now draped in silk and diamonds, walking beside the ink cloud like she belonged there. The whispers started instantly, spreading through the crowd like wildfire. Who was she? Where had she come from? What kind of hold did she have over a man who'd never shown interest in anyone? Director Kang was near the bar, surrounded by his usual associates. When he saw Zoe, his expression shifted through surprise to calculation to something that looked almost like hunger. Tae-sung leaned close to her ear, his breath warm against her skin. He's watching. Remember what we discussed? Zoe nodded, her heart hammering. She wasn't invisible anymore. She was the bait. And somewhere in this room full of predators and power, the trap was waiting to spring. She just hoped she'd survive long enough to see it close. The gallery's back hallway was dimly lit, artwork casting strange shadows on white walls. Zoe walked slowly, counting her steps like Tae-sung had instructed. 20 paces from the main room. Far enough to be isolated. Close enough to be heard if things went wrong. She heard footsteps behind her before she saw him. Director Kang emerged from the shadows, his smile predatory and confident. Lost? He asked, his tone falsely concerned. These galleries can be confusing for people who aren't used to them. The insult was casual, practiced. Reminding her that she didn't belong here, that the dress and diamonds were just costumes. I needed air, Zoe said, keeping her voice steady. The crowd was overwhelming. Kang moved closer, blocking her path back to the main room. I can imagine. It must be quite a change from serving champagne to wearing silk. Tell me, what exactly does the ink cloud see in you? I don't know what you mean. Don't play stupid. His voice hardened. Tae-sung doesn't do romance. He doesn't do weakness. Which means you're either a very clever trap, or you're a genuine vulnerability he's too distracted to recognize. He reached into his jacket, and Zoe's pulse spiked. But instead of a weapon, he pulled out a phone, showing her a photograph. Marcus, leaving his university building, unaware he was being watched. Your brother, Kong said softly. Studying engineering, isn't he? A bright future ahead of him. It would be a shame if something happened to interfere with that future. This was it. The moment they'd planned for. What do you want? Zoe whispered, letting fear show in her voice. Not all of it was acting. Information. Tae-sung's schedule. His security protocols. His weaknesses. Kong leaned closer. Give me what I need, and your brother stays safe. Refuse, and... The lights went out. In the sudden darkness, Zoe heard movement, professional and precise. When the emergency lighting kicked in 3 seconds later, Kong was on his knees, arms pinned behind his back by 2 of Tae-sung's men. His phone lay on the floor, still displaying Marcus's photograph. Tae-sung stepped out of a doorway Zoe hadn't noticed, his expression cold and satisfied. Thank you, Director Kong, he said quietly, for making threats on camera. They moved Kong to a private room in the gallery's basement, away from the guests who continued their champagne conversations upstairs, oblivious to the war being settled beneath their feet. Tae-sung stood in front of Kong with the patience of someone who had already won and was simply waiting for his opponent to understand it. Kang's expensive suit was rumpled now, his confidence cracking like thin ice. You recorded me, Kong said, his voice tight with rage and disbelief. I recorded you threatening a civilian, Tae-sung corrected. Threatening her family. Making it clear you intended harm. He pulled out his own phone, playing back the hallway conversation in crystal clarity. This recording is already with 3 different lawyers and 2 journalists. Insurance, in case something happens to me or the girl. Kang's face went pale. You can't, the rules. You broke the rules first, Tae-sung interrupted, his voice dropping to something cold and final. When you questioned my control in public. When you sent men to her apartment. When you threatened a university student who has nothing to do with our business. He moved closer, and even Zoe, standing near the door, felt the temperature in the room drop. You wanted to prove I'd gone soft. That I'd lost my edge. So let me be clear about something. In one fluid motion, Tae-sung grabbed Kong by his silk tie, yanking him forward. I kissed her as a strategic move. But you made it personal when you went after her brother. And personally, Director Kong, is when I stop being civilized. If you kill me, Kong gasped, my people will. Your people already know you failed, Tae-sung said. The Busan shipment? The laundered accounts? I've already seized them. Your financial network is gone. Your allies are distancing themselves as we speak. You're not a threat anymore. You're a cautionary tale. He released Kong, who stumbled backward, his perfect silk suit now wrinkled and stained with sweat. Get out of Seoul, Tae-sung said quietly. Tonight. If I see you again, the recording goes public and you'll face charges that even your lawyers can't fix. Do you understand? Kong nodded, his arrogance finally, completely shattered. The ink cloud had proven his point. Weakness was an illusion. Control was absolute. The gallery had emptied by the time they returned upstairs, guests dispersing into the Seoul night with new gossip and updated allegiances. Zoe stood near the windows, still wearing the midnight blue silk, watching the city lights blur through glass. Her hands were shaking now that the adrenaline was fading, the reality of what had just happened settling into her bones like ice. Your brother will be home by morning, Tae-sung said from behind her. With security that will stay until we're certain Kong is actually gone. Zoe nodded but didn't turn around. And then what? I go back to being invisible? Pretend none of this happened? You can't go back to the cathedral, he said. Too many people know your face now. Know what you mean to, he stopped, the sentence hanging unfinished in the air. That made her turn. What do I mean to you? Tae-sung was loosening his tie, a rare crack in his perfect armor. He looked tired suddenly, less like an apex predator and more like a man who had been holding himself together through sheer force of will. The kiss was strategic, he said quietly. A calculated move to answer Kang's challenge and protect an asset. That's what I told myself. And now? He was silent for a long moment, his dark eyes studying her with an intensity that felt different from before. Not calculating. Not measuring. Just seeing. Now I realize that somewhere between the cathedral and tonight, you stopped being a variable I could control, he admitted. You became something else. Something I didn't plan for. Zoe's breath caught. What does that mean? It means I'm compromised, Tae-sung said, and there was something almost like wonder in his voice, as if he was discovering a new concept he'd never encountered before. For the first time in 15 years, I made decisions based on something other than pure strategy. I protected you not just because you were useful, but because the thought of you being hurt. He stopped again, jaw tightening. Tae-sung, Zoe whispered. I don't know how to do this, he said, gesturing between them. Whatever this is. I only know how to survive. Then maybe, Zoe said carefully, we figure it out together. 6 months later, Zoe walked into the Cathedral of Shadows wearing Chanel and confidence in equal measure. The transformation was complete, but not in the way anyone had expected. She wasn't Tae-sung's decoration or his trophy. She had become something the Seoul elite had never seen before, a partner who understood both worlds, the invisible service class and the visible power structure, and could move between them with deadly precision. Marcus was finishing his engineering degree, his tuition paid in full, his safety guaranteed by a security detail so discreet he barely noticed them anymore. He'd asked questions at first, worried about his sister's sudden change in circumstances. Zoe had told him a version of the truth. She'd found a better job, one that paid well and offered opportunities. She hadn't mentioned that her job involved sitting in on business meetings where fortunes were decided, or that her observations, honed by years of being invisible, had helped Tae-sung consolidate power across 3 provinces. Tonight, they were meeting with shipping executives from Busan, the same operations Kong had tried to steal. Tae-sung sat at the head of the table in his usual position of authority, but Zoe sat beside him now, not behind or below. An equal. The executives noticed. Everyone noticed. Ms. Vaughn, one of them said carefully, we weren't expecting you to be part of these negotiations. Then you haven't been paying attention, Tae-sung replied, his tone flat. She sees things I miss. Hear things I don't. If you want this deal to work, you negotiate with both of us. It was a statement that would have been impossible 6 months ago. The ink cloud, admitting someone else had value beyond their utility. Admitting vulnerability by acknowledging partnership. But the rules had changed. Zoe had changed them. After the meeting, they stood together near the windows overlooking Seoul's glittering sprawl. Tae-sung's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining with a naturalness that had taken months to develop. Do you miss it? He asked quietly. Being invisible? Zoe thought about the girl in the gray uniform, head down, desperate to survive each shift. That person felt like someone from another lifetime. No, she said. I don't miss being a ghost. She was real now. Visible. Powerful. And the Cathedral of Shadows would never be the same.